History Secrets.
Among the accounts of Jesus' life preserved in the Gospels of the New Testament, there is a period that remains almost completely silent. The texts narrate his birth. They describe episodes of his childhood, and they present a singular moment that occurred when he was about 12 years old. Luke, chapter 2, verses 41 to 50, recounts that Jesus accompanied his parents to Jerusalem during the Passover feast. When the caravan began to return home, Mary and Joseph realized that he was not among the relatives. After searching for him for 3 days, they found Jesus in the temple. He was conversing with the teachers of the law. Everyone was amazed at his understanding and at the questions he asked. After this episode, the Gospel of Luke adds only a brief sentence. Luke, chapter 2, verse 52 states that Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, and grace before God and men. And then the biblical narrative jumps directly to the beginning of his public ministry, when he was about 30 years old. This long interval of nearly 2 decades came to be known by many scholars as the silent years or the lost years of Jesus. What happened during that period? Why do the Gospels record virtually no details of those years? To understand this mystery, we first need to observe how the Gospels were written. To understand why there is this long silence about the life of Jesus between the ages of 12 and 30, it is important to observe the main purpose of the Gospels. The authors of these texts were not trying to write complete biographies in the modern sense. The main focus was to present the spiritual meaning of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. For this reason, the Gospels dedicate most of their narrative to the final years of his public life. The teachings, the miracles, the conflicts with religious authorities, and the events that would lead to the crucifixion. Within this context, many details of Jesus' daily life were simply not recorded. This does not mean that those years did not exist. It only indicates that the authors of the Gospels did not consider it necessary to describe them in detail. Even so, some clues appear in the biblical texts themselves. For example, the Gospel of Mark mentions Jesus being called a carpenter. Mark, chapter 6, verse 3, records the reaction of the people of Nazareth. They ask, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary?" This detail suggests that Jesus likely worked in Joseph's profession for many years, living a common life in the small village of Nazareth. But, throughout history, several hypotheses have emerged about this poorly documented period. Some of these ideas appear in ancient traditions and apocryphal texts. Over the centuries, the silence of the Gospels about this period aroused great curiosity. Some ancient traditions began to imagine what might have happened during those years. Certain apocryphal texts attempted to fill this gap with narratives about the youth of Jesus. These writings describe episodes that would have taken place in Nazareth during his adolescence. But there are also much broader traditions that suggest something different. The possibility that Jesus may have traveled to other regions during part of those years. One of the most well-known theories suggests that Jesus may have had contact with spiritual traditions outside of Judea. Some authors of the 19th century proposed the hypothesis that he may have traveled to regions of India or Tibet. According to these theories, Jesus would have studied Eastern spiritual teachings before returning to Palestine. These ideas gained popularity in certain modern spiritual circles. But it is important to note that there is no solid historical evidence to confirm these journeys. Most historians consider these narratives to be later speculations. Even so, they show how the mystery of the silent years continued to stimulate the imagination of many people. Another hypothesis discussed by some scholars is related to daily life itself in Nazareth. During the 1st century, Nazareth was a small village in the region of Galilee. Archaeologists estimate that the population probably did not exceed a few hundred inhabitants. It was a simple, rural, and relatively isolated environment. In this context, many researchers consider that the silent years of Jesus may have been years of ordinary life, work, family life, participation in the religious traditions of the community. As the son of a carpenter, it is likely that Jesus learned from an early age the craft of working with wood and construction. The Greek word used in the Gospels to describe this work can also refer to a craftsman or builder, someone who worked not only with wood, but also with stone and other materials. This means that Jesus may have participated in construction projects in nearby villages. Some cities in the region were growing during that period. Among them was Sepphoris, an important city located a few kilometers from Nazareth. This possibility suggests that Jesus may have spent part of his youth working as a craftsman in the region of Galilee. In addition to daily work, it is likely that the silent years of Jesus were also marked by a deep religious formation. Life in the 1st century Galilee was strongly tied to Jewish traditions. Families regularly participated in the reading of the Torah in local synagogue. From a very young age, Jewish children learned passages of Scripture. They studied the stories of the patriarchs, and they memorized teachings of the law. The episode that took place in the temple when Jesus was 12 years old already provides a clue about this formation. Luke, chapter 2, verse 46, describes Jesus speaking with teachers of the law in Jerusalem. He asked questions, and he answered with great understanding. This detail suggests that his religious education began very early. During the following years, it is likely that this learning continued. Jesus would have studied the sacred texts of the Jewish tradition, the Psalms, the prophets, the stories of Moses and Abraham. These teachings would form the basis of the ideas that would later appear in his parables and teachings. Thus, although the Gospels do not describe these years in detail, they were probably fundamental in the spiritual formation of Jesus. Another important element for understanding the silent years of Jesus is the cultural environment of Galilee during that period. The region was a meeting point of different influences. Ancient Jewish traditions coexisted with the presence of Roman rule and elements of Hellenistic culture. Cities such as Sepphoris and Tiberias were developing in the region. They had had theaters, markets, and a more intense urban life. Even living in Nazareth, a small village, Jesus likely had indirect contact with this broader cultural environment. This context may help explain the diversity of images and examples that later appear in his teachings. Jesus frequently used parables inspired by everyday life. Seeds sown in the field, shepherds caring for sheep, workers hired for the harvest, women preparing bread. These images deeply reflect the rural and social environment of Galilee. They show someone who knew well the daily life of ordinary people in the region. Thus, the silent years of Jesus may have been a period of observation and experience, years in which he lived, immersed in the reality of his people. When we bring all these possibilities together, we realize that the so-called lost years of Jesus do not necessarily need to be seen as a mysterious period in a supernatural sense. They may simply represent a long interval of ordinary life, work, learning, participation in community life, spiritual preparation. For nearly 18 years, Jesus likely lived like any other young Jewish man of Galilee. helping his family, learning a trade, participating in religious festivals and the traditions of his people. It is only around the age of 30 that the Gospels begin to record his story in detail again. Luke chapter 3, verse 23, states that Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his public ministry. This beginning is associated with his encounter with John the Baptist. The moment of baptism in the Jordan River marks the start of a new phase. From that point on, the Gospels begin to record teachings, miracles, and encounters that would profoundly transform the religious history of the world. Thus, the silent years can be seen as a period of preparation, a phase in which ordinary life precedes the beginning of an extraordinary mission. When modern historians analyze this period of Jesus' life, they often emphasize an important point. The silence of the Gospels does not necessarily mean an absence of history. It only means that the authors of these texts were interested in a different narrative focus. The main objective was to present the spiritual message transmitted by Jesus during his ministry. That is why the narrative concentrates on the final years of his life. Even so, some scattered clues in the Gospels suggest that Jesus was known in his community before beginning his public mission. When he begins to teach in the synagogues, some people in Nazareth express surprise. Mark chapter 6, verse 2, records the reaction of those who hear him. They ask where this wisdom, these miracles come from. Then they say, "Is this not the carpenter?" This comment indicates that Jesus was seen as an ordinary person within the community, someone whose daily life was known by the inhabitants of the village. This reinforces the idea that the silent years were years of simple life, years that prepared the stage for the appearance of a teacher who would transform the religious history of his time. When we observe the set of historical and religious traditions, we realize that the years between the childhood and the beginning of Jesus' ministry remain one of the most silent periods in the entire gospel narrative. The texts of the New Testament preserve only a few indications. We know that Jesus grew up in Nazareth, that he learned a trade, that he participated in the religious life of his community, and that he developed a deep familiarity with the Jewish scriptures. These elements suggest a spiritual and human formation that developed over many years. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this silence is precisely the contrast it creates. For nearly 2 decades, the life of Jesus remains outside the center of the narrative. But when he finally appears publicly, his teachings quickly attract the attention of crowds soon. His words provoke reflection. His actions awaken admiration and also opposition. Thus, the silent years can be seen as a period of invisible preparation, a phase in which an ordinary life precedes a mission that would profoundly shape the religious history of humanity. And perhaps it is precisely this contrast that makes this period so fascinating for scholars and readers to this day. The search to understand the past has always been part of the human journey. We explore ruins, decipher ancient inscriptions, and investigate forgotten accounts. Each discovery expands our understanding of the civilizations that came before us, but it also reveals new questions. Questions that continue to drive our curiosity, because history is not just a record of the past, it is a continuous path of discovery. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.